The GeoRegion proposal came out of Friends of Ku-ring-gai Chase, which is one of these many volunteer groups we have in northern Sydney, suggesting that we ought to go for, I'm not a member of that, they ought to go for a UNESCO Global Geopark listing or a World Heritage listing of places like Ku-ring-gai Chase and Murgamara. That's a very big ask. It's something that's actually quite difficult to achieve, and then they looked at it further and they thought, no, there's another way to go, and that's to set this place up as a georegion in the first instance, which is happening around the world in lots of places, where the focus is on the nature of the geology, the landscape that's associated with the geology, and the way that landscape has been used. And it isn't necessarily just in national parks, it could be anywhere. We see this northern region of the parks and the environments as being a Sydney sandstone type landscape, which is pretty unique on a global type scale. It has lots of interesting things in it, we call them geosites, and if we can document all of those and put them together in a way that they can be interpreted through walks like today, or through some sort of an app that you can pick up on your phone and just visit the individual places and learn more about them, people will better appreciate this kind of landscape. So a georegion, once it's up and running as an entity, will need to be managed by somebody at a government agency type level, not necessarily national parks, perhaps a separate body indeed of their own kind. And once it's up and running over a couple of years, it can then be put forward to the federal government for nomination as a global geopark on a larger scale and sent to UNESCO. Once it gets to UNESCO, the attitude will be that they send assessors out to say whether or not this place really does have those universal values, which are rather like World Heritage values, but a bit more specific. And if it does, they will give it an imprimatur and say, wacko bit, we've got a Ku-ring-gai GeoRegion, everybody should go there and have a lovely time, blah, 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 blah. There's about 200 of these georegions around the world at the present time. They've grown fairly rapidly in the last few years. Australia has none. New Zealand got one last year, and it's the first in the southern environments, and we've got 3 in the pipeline at the present time, which are coming up as being possible. Ku-ring-gai GeoRegion, the one we're dealing with today, the Murchison GeoRegion in Western Australia, which is physically enormous and rather difficult to visit because it's in such a remote area, and another one up in the New England tablelands, which has got a head start in running because the people up in New England, Armidale, etc., are more attuned to the values of ecotourism than we tend to be in Sydney. We tend to be a bit isolated from it. But I think the Ku-ring-gai will get up. We've got strong support from politicians in New South Wales and to some extent with the federal government. Everybody's sort of fairly happy with it. The local governments that are involved, Northern Beaches, Hornsby and Ku-ring-gai, are all reasonably enthusiastic, and it's not necessarily going to cost them anything much, and so we've got all that sort of level of support. We still need support from the community at large and from the Aboriginal community in particular, because that's a very important question that the UNESCO will finally ask us. Do you have the support of Indigenous peoples? That's proved to be something of a stumbling block. It's hard to get that connection going, but I think we'll get there in the end. We're certainly working at it. So I think it's a pretty exciting sort of development. We've recognised some 50 or so geosites just within this northern Regis block, Murgamara, Ku-ring-gai Chase, a bit of Garrigal and across to the coast. We're establishing or hoping to establish, and got local government assistance to do so, walking trails which have got interpretation signs on them, and we'll finally set up some sort of phone app that you can get the data from here in Ku-ring-gai Chase, running down here to the Resolute Bay track. One on the northern beaches. The first one will be at Long Reef, which is a fantastic geological exposure of the tertiary rocks. A smaller one over in Brownsfield in the Lane Cove Valley, which is on a diatreme, and by this time next year or thereabouts, the new Hornsby Park will be open, which sits on the old Hornsby Quarry, which is one of the volcanic necks, and most of the exposure of the neck is still available, and that will be geologically interpreted, and that's a really important place because it's one of the best geological exposures of a volcanic neck anywhere in the world, and that's really up there internationally. So we've been at it for 4 years, I think. Slowly is the message. you get the enthusiasm, you get the yes, yes, sounds like a great idea from all of the concerned bodies that have to make the final decisions, but getting them to the next step and actually putting in the signs and marking out the trails and so forth is a little bit more difficult. You get classic yes minister reactions time and time again. Everybody's warm and fuzzy about it, but moving them on can be quite tricky. But constant pressure and with the right sorts of people pushing behind it, we'll get there. It doesn't have the same status as a national park. We're not talking necessarily about natural areas. Some of the geosites could be right in the middle of the suburbs. Many of them are already recognised. Long Reef, for example, is not national park type status, but the geology there and its exposure is fantastic when you know about it. If you just take a walk around Long Reef, it's just rocks, or you might be interested in the platform. It doesn't in any way impose on ordinary land management of the land as it exists at the present time. The strength of this particular proposal is that it does include the national park areas which are protected. But in terms of using the georegion as an argument for preservation of to stop development, for example, on the northern beaches or something like that, no, it won't work.
In fact, it would be an impediment to getting community support and local government support if there were additional regulatory restrictions that came into place as a result of the georegion establishment. So it's very similar to a biosphere reserve, if you know what that was. Biosphere reserves and georegions are very similar in that they're multi-tenure proposals where individual sites are identified and interpreted so that the value for scientific research and for education is sort of the main themes behind it. But the fact that they are established, there's like a moralistic protection that comes into place. It's like a discretionary regulatory environment rather than an imposed legislative type restrictions that get applied. So yeah, georegions are very similar to UNESCO biosphere, and the geo is the geo-heritage values rather than the biodiversity values of the place. So when we think about natural heritage, quite often we think about biodiversity. We don't really think too much about the geodiversity values of the place, which is a foundation for the biodiversity. So we're actually standing on a volcanic dike at the moment, and the trees around us, particularly some species here, such as the large fruited red mahogany, which is the stringy bark or the mahogany that is there. That species only occurs in certain areas in Ku-ring-gai Chase that are associated with high nutrient status of the soils. And because the dike is here, that's why that species is here, and that species actually follows the dike in this area. So it's examples like that where the geo-heritage values are the foundation for some of the biodiversity values as well.
Bob, can you explain what a dike is?
It's an American woman with strange tastes. The alternative version is that it's a sheet-like vertical intrusion of volcanic rock. So we have a linear feature along the top of this ridge which actually can be traced on the air photos for about 25 kilometres. It's 8 to 10 to maybe 15 metres wide, and where it comes across the top of the ridge like here, it dominates the soil and controls the type of the soil that develops at this point, and as a consequence you get this different vegetation association on it. The serpentines are classic. A bit further down the road you get the broadleaf grass tree, for example. You go off the edge of the dike and those things stop. It's a really sharp line. So a dike has come up from the mantle as a molten mass. It's gone through the countryside as a linear sheet. It tends to be vertical. It can be at some different angles. If it gets flat enough to be nearly horizontal, the same thing is called a sill, S-I-L-L. We don't have too many sills in Sydney. Dikes, however, are quite common. You don't often see fresh rock because the volcanic basalt-like material that occurs in them weathers faster than the sandstones, and it becomes a deeper soil and it becomes an incised landscape usually. Gully lines tend to follow them because they wear out, erode more rapidly. They're probably Jurassic, but we now know that there are actually a whole range of age of dikes in the Sydney Basin, going from the Jurassic right through the Tertiary and so you can't be absolutely specific about any one. This one, however, crosses the Pittwater and is on the north face of Barrenjoey at sea level, where there is fresh rock, and it's been dated, and that one is Jurassic. This one is Jurassic. It's probably the biggest dike in Sydney, but unfortunately there's another one down in that runs through the container wharf and across to Maroubra in Sydney Harbour, and that's been called the Great Sydney Dyke. So we've sort of lost the rights to the name. This is the Greater Sydney Dyke. You're probably familiar with Peach Crater over in Mugamara. The term crater refers to their apparent shape. They look like craters. They're big round circular or semicircular hollows in the sandstone landscape. They're not craters. They are points where a volcanic neck or a diatreme, a vertical column, a roughly circular column of lava and broken up country rock has erupted up through the landscape, blown out of the surface as a shallow volcanic lake, or a thing called a maar, M-A-A-R, which is on the Jurassic surface about 1 kilometre above us. Gone. The real crater for Campbell's Crater was up there. The present day crater isn't a crater, it's a geomorphic phenomenon of weathering and erosion on that softer, more easily eroded rock. So it's a bit of a misnomer. Bob's also mentioned the fact that we have these very distinctive veg patterns on the volcanic rocks. We do, and we immediately jump to, oh, it's got to be nutrients, because everybody knows basalt's got more nutrients in it than sandstones. But it's much more subtle than that, and we don't fully understand it. When you do analysis of the soils that are actually here on West Head and chase the amount of phosphorus in them and so forth, which is commonly a limiting factor for sandstone, for Sydney vegetation, you'd find that it isn't all that much higher than the adjacent sandstone. So it must also be other elements in there that are important. Maybe trace elements, but certainly the biggest one that, to my mind, is the moisture relationships in the soil. The clay soil from the volcanic rock holds much moisture much more effectively than does the sandstone for longer periods of time. And I think it's possibly as simple as that, wetter, drier, moister, drier type sites that give you these differences. Geologists and others are always jumping to conclusions where they're very often wrong. And they get repeated again and again.
In terms of the tree species that are here, so we've got some very large Angophora costatas, which red gum or smooth-barked apple, common names. We've got turpentine, and there's an example behind us of a turpentine. Also the large tree through here is a turpentine. They were very valued and still are valued trees because the timber in turpentine trees resist the shipworm. So quite often they're used for jetty piles or wharf piles because they're much more resistant to attack by shipworms. And behind us we've also got grey gums, which is the favourite tree of koalas. When we first got here, some of you might have heard the call of a glossy black cockatoo feeding in a tree just through here. They're specialists, they like the casuarinas. Casuarina torullosa, which is what this tree is, the forest oak, it is dioecious, meaning that it's either male or female. And that tree we know is a male tree because of that the golden ends to the cladodes, which is the male part of the tree. That's where the pollen is produced. And we can find a female tree by finding a tree that has cones on it. We're at the red-hand side. The rocks here are a canvas for the Aboriginal people who existed in this area for at least the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. So some of the sites where dating has occurred takes us back 3,000, maybe 4,000 years. These geological features here are a canvas for Aboriginal art and for Aboriginal people to express themselves and to tell stories. Here we've got 2 hand stencils that are in red ochre that are very hard to see. But it would have been mixed with maybe animal fat or blood or water, then placed in the mouth. The ochre material was then sprayed across the hand. So in this case we've got red ochre, We've also got white ochre stencils in the park of hands, of boomerangs, of spears and of other objects. So there is one site near Hallett's Beach in Cowan Waters which has got 60 white hand stencils in the cave. And it's thought that the hand stencils are like our form of graffiti. It's like a mark that I was here. So it's like a signature of I was here. And we also have what are called hand prints. And there is one at the back of Mackerel Beach where instead of them being stenciled, they've actually painted their hand with the ochre and then put their hand up on the cave, and so it's a hand print rather than a hand stencil. One other form of art in a shelter like this is the use of charcoal. So red ochre, white ochre and charcoal drawings. And there is one site just where you turn off Macars Creek Road to come here. There's a cave just near the bridge there which has got like a net. It's a grid pattern has been drawn in charcoal on that shelter. Peter?
The net pattern's an interesting one because that occurs in caves right across New South Wales, often in white ochre or drawn with some other material. And one of the theories that was suggested to me by a Western Division archaeologist some years ago was that it marked the finish of the occupation of that site. And that may be some of the most recent Aboriginal rock art engraving decorations, and we don't know that for sure. We're quite happy to say these things are hand stencils. Then we immediately leap to say, oh, it's sort of Aboriginal graffiti. But no, it may not be. We don't have the right to make that interpretation. It was put there by some individual for a purpose, and it presumably had some meaning to them, but we're absolutely guessing as to what that meaning might be. These days, when you talk about drawings or paintings of wombats or engravings of animals and so forth, the archaeologists are tending to say exclamation mark kangaroo, as if to say it looks like a kangaroo, but it could be something else. And it could have had some other purpose, because you cannot put yourself into the mindset of the Aboriginal people of several hundred or several thousand years ago and say this has that sort of meaning. You can say that these sites are important and significant, and they still are from an Aboriginal perspective and from our perspective too, hopefully, but making the interpretation is really, really challenging.
Parks do a lot to protect sites in terms of removal of graffiti. So they have specialists who can remove graffiti. Quite a lot of these shelters have graffiti in them. Sometimes you'll get termite runs across the rock surface. Sometimes you'll get seepage running across the surface. They'll put in what's called a drip line to take the water off the site. So and sometimes they'll put barriers up like this to stop people from wanting to. Yeah, sometimes even cages in some cases. So yeah, parks will do that in some cases, but they will always work with the Aboriginal community, whatever they do, and not just consult them, but actually involve them in the work as well.
Come back to the rock itself. We're dealing with a quartz sandstone. It's towards the top of the Hawkesbury sandstone, which is a Triassic age rock, 245 million years ago. It's pretty typical of much of the area of Sydney, Ku-ring-gai Chase and down through Royal National Park. It's the second highest rock unit in the Sydney Basin, in the Sydney area proper. It looks like the same sandstones that you find up in the Blue Mountains, but in fact it's not, because the Hawkesbury sandstone chops out at the top of the Lapstone Hill roughly, and beyond that the same looking sandstone is actually an older unit which is beneath our feet, and that's called the Banks Wall sandstone. If we go down through the ground beneath us, you're only 1 kilometre from the end of Permian extinction event, when 80% of the world's fauna and flora disappeared because of some huge event in the atmosphere which was global. 1 kilometre away from the biggest extinction of all time, but it's down there. It's just about the top of the coal measures. The coal is just underneath us, and we know the coal that outcrops at Newcastle and Lithgow and Wollongong is down there because we dug a hole at Balmain and started dragging it out. There's actually a coal mine that extends underneath Sydney Harbour. There was to be another one at Cremorne, so they did a lot of drilling in that area in the 1890s and proved that whole sequence. So the whole pile of rocks that we're standing on near the top of this system is Permian and Triassic in age, and we're up near the top of it. Above us again there is the Waianamatta shales, which occur in western Sydney in the low-lying area of the Cumberland Basin. They would have occurred above this yet again, and beyond that we know that there was a Jurassic landscape with Jurassic rocks in it, which, as I commented earlier, is subsequently eroded away. Jurassic being 175 million years ago, plenty of time to do that erosion, even at just ordinary very slow sorts of rates. Rocks disappear. This particular sandstone is, we divide the Hawkesbury sandstone into 3 different sorts of rock. You look at the map and it's all green and it's labelled Hawkesbury sandstone. Then you read the fine print and it says quartz sandstones, conglomerates, shales, lamanites and blah 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 blah. And you think, oh, I thought it was all just sandstone. We'll see that today. We'll see other rock types in what is called the Hawkesbury sandstone. The name is a convenience for the geologists. They decided that this stuff was so widespread around Sydney and all had the same sort of characteristics, occurred in this confined area, we'll give it a name and we'll call it after something local. It's just a name, that's all it is. We believe that it was laid down in a huge river system of braided streams coming from Antarctica. Right, Antarctica was part of Australia at that stage. 240 million years ago we were still all part of Gondwana, a larger continent. The river system had headwaters in Antarctica, flowed along more or less the east coast through Victoria and started dumping its sand in what was then the beginning of the end of the Sydney Basin, this stuff here. 3 different kinds of rocks, 2 different sandstones. This is what we call sheet facies sandstone because it has all this fine-grained layering in it, bedding, which tends to have cross beds. You notice that every now and then one cuts across another and cuts across another. Those are low dunes, about this sort of high, moving down a stream bed in slow flow conditions. Minimum flow. They're just shifting sand as little sand waves on the bed of the stream. Then comes a bit of a higher flow, a bit of a flood. It rips the top of them off and deposits a bed which is essentially planar and flat, and then the river slows down again and you form the dunes once more, and on it goes. And over time these dunes build up, and you get this sort of sequence of sheet facies sandstone, characterised by this cross bedding. Now it's a bit unusual to get cavernous weathering like this of this scale in the sheet facies. The other sandstone that we get is what we call massive facies, and we'll get to that in another site. We can demonstrate it to you more clearly, where a whole thickness of sandstone like we have here is just uniform. That you can't see any bedding in it. It often has a trough-like shape in cross-section, and at the bottom of the trough there's often a layer of conglomerate, maybe only 10 centimetres or so thick. That's a situation where the channel of the river that was depositing this sand dumped a huge amount of sand in a flood, a big flood, that ripped through the landscape, cut its way down into the pre-existing sediments and dumped all the sand at once as the flood started to recede. Massive facies sandstone tends to have a hardened outer surface of it, as you can see here too with this sheet version, which once that case hardening is broken, it frets away pretty easily underneath. And it does it in a series of steps, from a big hollow like that one to a little hollow like this one. And this one you can see some beautiful fresh colours in the rock here, but at the bottom of there's a whole lot of little pile of sand. That's actually fretted off that face. That fretting occurs from salt spray coming in from the ocean. Salt's just gently drifting in here, hitting the rock, setting in there, and the salt dries out, the moist salt dries out, frets off the sand grains, and down they tumble. So that's your cavernous weathering in process. Constant erosion on a grain by grain state, with the edge of the cavern being resistant to that sort of erosion because it's been given this case hardening effect, which is probably cementation by silica, which has moved out of the sandstone itself. We get it in both the sheet facies and the massive facies. The massive tends to be better caverns, and you often find more of your engravings in there, but this is a pretty good one for sheet facies stuff. The other thing about these caverns is, although the people have left their mark, they didn't occupy it, because the floor on which you're standing of a protected overhang where you, if it was raining, you could get out of the rain and light a little fire in there and spend a day or two till the weather came good, you would usually have occupation debris in it, signs of hearths and burning, occasional stone flakes and so forth, and perhaps the remains of whatever they've been eating, wallabies or snakes, or if you're closer to the beach, shellfish and so forth. There isn't any in this one because it's on a rock floor and just got modern day debris through it, which is unusual, a bit unusual. A cavern this big usually has some sort of evidence of having been lived in. Does that mean that it was a bit special, that you didn't live in it? Speculation again.
There's at least a dozen or more skeletons that have been uncovered in this area. Usually not so high up. Usually they are in a dune type system. Angophora Reserve, do people know about Angophora Reserve? So 6 skeletons were uncovered in Angophora Reserve, 3 adults, 2 children and a baby, and 5,000 artefacts. So what Peter was talking about before, I think 5,500 artefacts, so stone tools of one sort or another, have been uncovered from that cave in that excavation, plus a huge amount of skeletal material from the fauna which existed in the area, including penguins. And there's some very interesting engravings actually of penguins in this area, so potentially a food source for Aboriginal people. But there are also records there of skeletal material from mammals that don't currently exist in the area, like the Palmer wallaby and the red-necked paddymmelon, for example. They were also found in that cave system. Narrabeen Man, I think Peter was associated with Narrabeen Man.
Narrabeen Man is famous because he was found underneath, literally underneath a bus stop, underneath the bus shelter, when a cable trench was put through. Archaeologists were called in and excavated him, and he was found to have been killed with a death spear, with tiny little silkreed microblade chips that have been mounted on the end of the spear. That's a characteristic thing. He was just under 3,700 years old on carbon dating, and it's the oldest record of a ritual killing or punishment type killing anywhere in Australia, and possibly even one of the oldest in the world. We don't know much about him other than that he must have been up to something pretty naughty, because he wasn't buried. He was just left lying in the sand dune and slowly covered by sand and naturally buried in that position that he died. Yeah, Ocean Road and Octavia Street intersection. There's a red brick bus shelter there. Next time you drive down there, just on the left-hand side coming south, yeah, that's Octavia Man's gravesite. No, well, he would have to be, or he may have been an interloper from some adjacent tribe up to no good, who knows.
So this area was developed in 1965, as I just said, and it came as a result of the transfer of West Head from the Commonwealth in 1950. West Head was largely privately owned between the late 1800s all the way through to the Second World War, when the Commonwealth resumed the land for military purposes. And there were gun emplacements placed just down the bottom of the cliff here. There were obviously enemy warships operating off the east coast of New South Wales, including the Japanese submarines and the midget submarines that came from that. 2 gun emplacements were placed down the bottom, together with a couple of searchlights, an ammunitions depot that was cut into the cliff face, and an observation platform also cut in. There's also some observation platforms a little bit further south from here, protecting Pittwater from the same thing. So yeah, it was private property. It was 640 acres. It was originally an estate that William Lawson, the explorer, yeah, it was private property all the way up until World War II, when the Commonwealth resumed the land, and the Commonwealth had it basically from 1940 through to about 1950, when it was then transferred back to the state. And there were military facilities here. They constructed a pulley system to get the guns down from West Head down to the bottom, to put the guns into place, 2 4.7-inch guns that looked across Broken Bay in case any Japanese submarines or warships came into Broken Bay. The National Fitness Centre acquired the buildings once the military had finished with them, and there was a fitness camp here until about 1964, when The state government then took over the remainder of West Head from the 1950 acquisition and decided to then redevelop the area. So this area here was established in 1965. That was managed by the Ku-ring-gai Chase Trust at the time, the whole park. In 1967, the National Parks and Wildlife Service was established, and then they took over the management of the area from the Trust. So that's the history of this area.
Put yourself back here 20,000 years ago, you're an Aboriginal who's just struggled to the top of this hill, and you had to climb 120 metres more than you would have today. You didn't come from the water level down there, you came from the beach and the water level 12 or 15 kilometres out there, because the sea level was that much lower. Why was the sea level so much lower? Because we were in the middle of the last ice age. The ice is made from water, the water had to come from somewhere, it comes from the oceans, and the oceans all around the world were about 100 to 150 metres lower than present. That's the volume of water that came out to convert into ice in ice caps and so forth. There weren't any ice caps here, it's just that the sea level went down. It was down for a period of roughly 10,000 years, which the dates are all a little bit woolly when you get down to the details, but for 10,000 years that was a coastal plain out there. That's where Aboriginal people lived, not back up here because this is too damned high and rough to climb up into, too far away from water, and probably didn't have nearly as good a food resources as the coastal edge did. So that's why we only find the younger Aboriginal things in the rock engravings and the cave paintings and so on, and not much in the way of substantive middens and older bodies. You do get lots of middens on Palm Beach Peninsula over there, that barrier of sand which ties Palm Beach itself to Barrenjoey. The textbooks will all tell you that that's a tombolo, a nice little geographic word that everybody grabs and thinks they understand. It simply means it's a tied island. The island is tied to the mainland by a spit of sand. That isn't how that one formed. So if it had a different genesis, should we give it the same name which relates to the form? I'm not sure. I don't like the word very much, but it's one of those things we'll never get rid of. Take away the water, put the coast out there 15k. We're now standing on a ridge that goes from here to Barrenjoey, dive down lower under the water there and back up the other side. The water depth in that gap is only about 30 metres. So that was dry land. The depth of the rock underneath the sand spit is 75 to 80 metres. Macars Creek came down in a valley down through Pittwater there and straight out through the middle of the sandbar offshore. So that sand has accumulated as sea level rose back up again. About 7,000 years ago. Again, the numbers are a little bit rubbery. A lot of the textbooks will say 5,000 or 6,000 years. We're now pushing it back between 7,000 and 8,000 years when sea level got to about its present position. Offshore out there, lots of low coastal plain with soils and so forth on it. All the sand was eroded on the beaches out there and washed forward onto the coastal edge here. That's where that sand came from. It filled the Macars Creek Valley with a sand body 70 odd metres deep. That's impressive, and it happened in just 10,000 years. Still on Hawkesbury sandstone, the upper third of Barrenjoey down to the level that you can see the first cliff faces. The bottom of the cliff faces is the base of the Hawkesbury at this point, and from that point on you go down into the Narrabeen Group rocks and the Newport series rocks, which are different sandstones and shales with different fossils in them. The Hawkesbury sands came from the south, the Newport Formation sands and gravels came from the north, in simple terms, and some of the gravels in the conglomerates in the Newport series actually can be traced back to the New England region. Hawkesbury sandstones from the Antarctic, the Newport Alder Formation coming from New England, got two huge river systems coming down, interacting here in this central part of the Sydney Basin. Back in Triassic Permian times, the coast was not far offshore because some of the rocks in the Permian are marine rocks. Bald Hill Claystone, for example, on Long Reef, we believe to be marine. Shallow water marine, probably near coastal, tidal. So that means that the coast as you see it today was more or less where it's always been. even though Australia has drifted off several hundred kilometres to the north in that time. On the north face of Barrenjoey, there's a long line of black rock which I can pick out, but you probably won't be able to see because that's where the basic dike runs through. It cuts off the face of there, comes up through about here roughly, and probably we're sitting on it, then chops through the tops of the next two hills back down the road here. This is our Greater Sydney Dyke that we've raved about before. In that same spot where the waves are breaking, there's now a seal colony that didn't used to be there, but people are not aware of. They're not particularly aggressive or nasty or anything, but they're damn hard to get to because the track that used to go around Barrenjoey is now pretty well buggered. It's quite a scramble. And we've got evidence of seals and Aboriginal middens in Sydney, so they're not new either. They're just new to us.
Do we redo the artwork? Well, we don't redo the stenciling or the artwork in the shelters, but sites like this, because it's a public site, and to reduce the risk of people taking action into their own to try to highlight it, to photograph the sites, parks involve the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council with highlighting the grooves. And what they do is they use nylon brushes really carefully under supervision with someone who knows the detail of the engraving and the motifs that are here. They use those nylon brushes just to remove the lichen and any algae that might accumulate in the groove. And they do it really carefully. They don't scratch it, they don't chalk it. They use those nylon brushes just to remove the lichen and the algae so that the groove becomes more highlighted and therefore enables people to photograph the site and to see what's here. And that reduces the risk of people doing this sort of thing, sort of scratching. Sometimes they scratch what's not there. They interpret the site themselves and say, this should be a footprint, I'll put some toes in. Or they don't scratch what is there. And therefore that also affects the integrity of the site. So unfortunately someone here hasn't followed the signage and has decided to do that. And over here as well, a fish has been scratched. People ask how old are these sites? There are engravings in the park. In fact, at Towlers Bay, there's an engraving of a sailing ship on a rock. Most of the sites are on horizontal rock surfaces, but there are quite a few that are also on vertical rock faces, particularly closer to the shoreline around the West Head Peninsula. There's some really great sites actually that are engraved on vertical rock faces, which you can, in a boat or a canoe, you can get access to see. One of the most common engraved motifs in the park are what we call mundois, or footprints. Again, as Peter said, who knows? There's a figure that is called Byami, the god figure, the person who lived in the sky. Darramoolan was apparently a son of Byami. Byami is often shown engraved like this, so arms and legs astride, quite a large figure. But obviously we have a male motive and a female motive next to that figure, and another human-like motive there. You'll see this motive here has got what people call a waistband, but I often think when I've seen these bands, and this one here as well, that they could well represent a waistband, but they could also represent a joint.
What's the significance of this spot? This is more than just doodles and graffiti. This spot has to have some sort of ritual behind it. You can speculate as much as you like as to what that ritual and that importance was, but you have to see it as in some way sacred, some way important. They've got to be at least 200 years old because nobody's been doing them for at least that period of time. They have been rubbed over on many occasions, so they're not quite what they were 200 years ago. And in past times when under Aboriginal management, they probably would have been refreshed fairly frequently. But this rock does weather away, and even the gentle brushing of the current management practice to show them up is brushing away sand grains as well as lichens. So that's in fact deepening them and changing them subtly. But as for total age, anybody's guess. But we do have some measure of rock weathering on these surfaces now, because engravings that were recorded by McCarthy in the 1940s, and many places are now so faint that you can barely recognise them. You have to bring out foils or mirror to shine low angle light across them to actually pick up what he was seeing pretty clearly in daylight. And now they're basically vanished. So 100 odd years and you're starting to lose them. 200 or 300 years we may end up only with these things that are being retouched. There are other sites in Sydney where they have been very heavily retouched by whitefellas. We came across one only a couple of weeks ago over in Newport. And we now also find European engravings that look exactly like, almost exactly like Aboriginal ones, but which were cut deliberately on unblemished rock surfaces as copies.
I was asked earlier, how did they make these engravings? So they would have obviously used we think a harder rock material than the sandstone. Those anthropomorphic figures, there is a suggestion that they may have stood on the rock surface like this, cast a shadow, and then traced out the shadow, including the fingers, as you can see. So maybe an outline was scratched, and then holes were drilled using this harder bit of rock. So maybe with a hammer rock as well, holes were drilled. And sometimes there are engravings that are just the holes. So there's quite a few spots around West Head where you see this outline of a figure and it's just the drilled holes. They're not connected like these ones are. But those holes eventually and mostly would be connected through grinding.
Bob used the word drilled a hole. It's very important that he used that because that's exactly what they did. I think they used quartz pebbles because they're easy to get around here. You flake the end of the quartz pebble so it's got a nice point and you just grind it into the sandstone. You can make a hole very quickly, very easily. Do that around the outline, then a braid between them and you've got yourself an engraving. National parks have interpreted it differently on this sign back here. They've got an Aboriginal squatting down with a pointed stone and a hammer stone on top of it. Think about that for a moment. You've got a smallish chisel and a large heavy hammerstone. When you go wang, 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 wang like that, what happens? The chisel smashes. It doesn't work. And you can demonstrate that. That is completely wrong and should be ripped out. The other thing that should be ripped out here, incidentally, is these timber bollards that were put in when this site was first protected back in the 70s, whatever it was. They're now at a stage where they're highly flammable, and that will cause a very hot burn all the way around the perimeter of the site and could do considerable damage. This spot has a very nice echidna on it, and they built a boardwalk across the sandstone platform to limit the amount of damage from people moving through it, but they built it of timber. And when the next fire came along, the boardwalk caught fire and was lost, and of course the sandstone was extensively damaged. I'd rather they didn't use timber at all.
This is the headdress of Darramurlan. This is an appendage which may be an outstretched arm. We're really not sure because it doesn't have any digits at the end of it. So there, and there is an obvious arm here anyway, holding what McCarthy thought was a dilly bag at the end of the arm. So here's the back of Darramurlan running down here. And somewhere, here it is here, this is his bottom, coming up here. So we need to be careful where we tread. And here is his leg, here with a foot. And here is the other side coming up to what we think might be an arm, but holding something, well, again, this is an interpretation. Maybe it's not something holding, but McCarthy interpreted this as being holding a dilly bag. And right behind me is an emu. And McCarthy didn't record this at the time, but there is something there that looks very much like an egg. And so this emu has toes, has a bottom, has a quite well pronounced leg and neck and head. And there it is there. And there is another smaller emu. So there's a surveying mark just down there, and there's other bits and pieces. There's a bit of graffiti here, which is probably quite old given the look of the lichen in the groove. But this is the important feature. This is Darramulin, we think is Darramulin, who I mentioned before, is the son of Byami, and is quite an important and commonly engraved spiritual figure in this area. But what we've got here as well is a fish and a shield. It's got a decoration running longitudinally, and it's got two lateral decorations running across. These shields and the decoration on these shields is quite often changes with the clan.
This is the so-called snake. It appears to have modification along it, which has probably been human. But if you look at the structure of it, it's quite long. And there's another couple parallel to it. They're not really joints in the sense that they don't proceed very deep into the rock. There's also a whole series of sub-parallel lines a bit further on echelon we call it, and that's indicating some degree of shear or movement of the rock along this line. So essentially this is a natural crack, but it's been exploited and modified a bit by humans. I reckon that's Aboriginal, those bits there, but the main structure is natural. Tessellations. It's just mentioned they've got nice tessellated pavements in Tasmania, Tasman Peninsula and Mount Wellington and places like that, where the reasons or the causes of those tessellations are obvious. They're volcanic rocks which have columnar joint patterns in them. I think the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, County Antrim, lots and lots of 5-6-sided columns which on the top surface give you pavements like that. But this isn't volcanic rock, this is sandstone. Oh, that's a bit different. They're fairly common in Sydney. They tend to be more distributed up on the tops of the plateau like here rather than elsewhere, but you do find them down the side sometimes. And this is one of the biggest and easiest to get to, and so it's had a lot of attention from geologists over the years who've come up with 3 different theories explaining them. The first was that they are in fact columnar sandstones, and they penetrate down through the sandstone body at depth, and they're probably caused by heating of the sandstone by an adjacent dike or volcanic neck or something of that nature. No dikes, no volcanic necks, and when you get to cut a section through this, as you can do in the road cut just here, the depth of the crack penetration is only that much. They're a surface feature, they're not a column. You do get columnar sandstone, and it occurs in Ku-ring-gai Chase. But they are 5-6-sided columns that go right through the whole bed of the sandstone. Different material entirely and different composition slightly. All right, geologist 1 scratched that theory, no good. Then he sat around for a while and the next conference came up and he presented a new model and said, there's always up on the shoulders of the ridge tops where they're exposed to the atmosphere with no vegetation on them. And back in the Pleistocene, we know temperatures were lower. This is when the sandstone cracked in freeze-thaw phenomena, like you see in polygons in the Arctic tundra. Hang on a minute. The Pleistocene, 6-degree average temperature drop over the year. That's not enough to give you freeze-thaw. It's probably not even enough to give you frosts, let alone frozen ground, let alone frozen solid sandstone. Scratch that theory. He then got another research grant that took him to London to the Geological Society for a congress. Whilst he was in London, he felt the need to go to the gentleman's toilet. This is a true story. He wrote it himself. I'm just repeating it. And on the wall of the gentleman's toilet, while he was standing there doing something else, he noticed that all the ceramic tiles had craze patterns on them, just like the sandstones here in Sydney.
You do your best thinking in toilets.
You do. There you go. So same guy, 3 publications, 3 theories, all of them obviously wrong. So what is the answer? They always occur on what I call this massive facies sandstone. We've been on a big block of massive facies sandstone. I can prove that again in the road cut. go to the road cut, you see the edge of this rock, the cracks going down that far through it, and beneath that it's homogeneous, absolutely homogeneous. The bottom of it has a beautiful curved shape with the base of the channel that brought this sand through, and about a 10 centimetre layer of pebbles conglomerate. A major flood storm event drove through the Hawkesbury River, the Triassic Hawkesbury River, dumping this sand as a single body of material about 3 to 4 metres thick. It was then buried by other rock up there, 1,000 metres up above us, something of that order, and over time it consolidated, became cemented, became hardened, then it became exposed. But having removed that 1,000 metres of rock above it, then exposing this stuff on the modern day surface, there were inherent stresses in that mass of homogeneous sand which had to be relieved, and as the surface comes up, as the surface goes down, the rock is exposed, it rises, stretches and cracks in a political pattern. Pretty simple, and it could be proved, if you had the right engineering technique, by measuring stress across the body of this rock. It would be fairly straightforward to do. That theory hasn't been published, and I'm probably not about to do it, but I think it's stronger than the other three. We started this talk talking about the GeoRegion concept. A couple of people have asked me during the day if they're a bit concerned about it because the GeoRegion is being linked to geotourism, and they have visions of huge cruise liners coming into Pittwater and disgorging thousands of people to come up here and look at the tessellated pavement. I don't see it like that at all. It will, if properly interpreted and available on the web or elsewhere, these sites will attract more visitors. And in small numbers and sensitive people that are interested in this sort of stuff, I don't see that as a problem at all. And it is a geotourism type venture. Just think of what you've done to yourselves today. You've spent 20 bucks or so on petrol, you might have bought some lunch, you're going to go home and have a cup of coffee en route or something or other. You'll have spent $50 on yourselves today without too much difficulty at all. And that's geotourism, because you've come out and looked at rocks with us. But you're a pretty exclusive group. The whole of Sydney doesn't want to come here. The whole world doesn't want to come here. And the people that do want to come here and see these sorts of things, I think they appreciate what they've got.